The overwhelming roar of thousands of voices all at once would have been your first experience on a medieval battlefield. Warriors shouting to each other, leaders calling orders, the pounding steps of charging men, and the panicked cries of animals trained for war. The clash of metal against metal echoed across the field, and you could hear the sounds of weapons striking shields and armor. Horses, terrified by the chaos, would let out piercing cries. Even the air itself felt different, carrying the sharp metallic scent of red stains and the damp earth beneath your feet, slippery from the movement of so many men and the mess left behind. If this sounds like something you could handle, let's take a closer look at why you probably would not last more than moments on a medieval battlefield. Many imagine knights in shining armor, castles rising above the horizon, and noble battles filled with honor. But the truth is far from romantic. It is important to understand that this was a world where survival often came down to sheer luck. And before any sword was swung, just getting to the battle was already exhausting. Armies often marched for days or even weeks before reaching their destination. Along the way, they faced hunger, unpredictable weather, and a lack of sleep. Supplies moved slowly, and food or fresh water could run out. Men often had to carry their own gear or help move heavy carts. By the time they arrived at the battlefield, many were already worn down. Sometimes they had already been in smaller fights on the way. Wars could have multiple major battles within days or weeks of each other, leaving no time for proper recovery. In the Wars of the Roses, for example, the battles of Barnet and Tewkesbury were only a few weeks apart. In the 100 Years' War, there were times when armies fought multiple engagements within days. Traveling between these battles was no easy journey. It could take days to move from one location to another. Alongside the soldiers, supply lines carrying food and weapons moved at the same slow pace. Many never even made it to the fight, passing away from cold, hunger, or disease on the way. One example was the English army at the Battle of Agincourt. After a long siege, disease swept through the troops, leaving many too weak to fight before they ever saw the enemy. When the fighting did begin, the noise itself became a weapon. Leaders often used horns or drums to signal commands, but these sounds were drowned out by the chaos. Warriors on the front line usually could not hear the call to advance or retreat. Instead, they moved by watching what the men around them were doing. One medieval writer even suggested that commanders should keep their opponents distracted with constant noise, movement, and attacks, so they would be overwhelmed both physically and mentally. Imagine a storm of arrows falling overhead, the constant boom of large weapons, and the blare of trumpets. The sound alone could drain a soldier's focus. Once the order to advance came, troops often marched forward in tight, organized groups. They did not run toward the enemy. The goal was to arrive with enough energy left to fight. As they approached, they would pause to tighten their lines, making sure there were no gaps. When close enough, they surged forward in a final push to hit the enemy with as much force as possible. In some cases, the enemy would be doing the exact same thing, and both sides would crash into each other with full momentum. If no one broke ranks immediately, the fight could last for hours. It is important to remember that many soldiers were not professionals. Some were simply healthy men who had been gathered on the march to the battlefield. Without formal training, they had to rely on instinct and whatever basic guidance they could follow. Battles could be long and grueling. The Battle of Towton during the Wars of the Roses lasted 10 hours in the middle of a snowstorm. And even if you decided to retreat, that did not guarantee safety. Soldiers who ran were often chased down by the enemy, sometimes facing harsher fates while fleeing than if they had stayed and fought. One of the deadliest hazards in medieval warfare was not the enemy's weapon, but the sheer press of people around you. Archaeological studies of battlefield remains show that many frontline soldiers passed away not from direct strikes, but from being crushed and trampled, often by their own side in moments of panic. When troops surged forward and stumbled, the soldiers behind them kept moving, sometimes toppling over one another. Once you fell, it was incredibly hard to get back up. The tightly packed formation that was meant to give you strength could turn into a trap. The sensory overload in these situations was intense. Inside a helmet, the air felt hot and damp, making it difficult to breathe. The noise from all directions, screams, orders, the clash of weapons, was overwhelming. The smell of sweat, damp clothing, and fear from those around you filled the air. Every step forward felt heavier as your body strained under the weight of armor and fatigue. Even without a weapon striking you, you could collapse from the heat, the crush of bodies, or simply losing your footing in the mud. If you were unlucky enough to fall in the middle of this chaos, the danger only increased. The weight of other soldiers could pin you down completely. You might be unable to see daylight as mud and moving feet covered your view. In that moment, your own side could become as dangerous as the enemy, simply because the momentum of the formation pushed them forward. Some soldiers passed away without ever being struck by a weapon, their final moments spent in confusion and panic as they were pressed into the ground. This was the harsh reality for many on medieval battlefields, and it was only the beginning. The clash itself, the weapons used, and what happened after the fighting was over reveal even more about why these battles were some of the most unforgiving environments in history. When soldiers finally met the enemy face to face, the fighting conditions were far from what movies often show. Combat was crowded and chaotic, leaving little room to swing a weapon freely. Warriors were pressed so close together that moving your arms too widely could bump into the person next to you. This is why weapons like axes, spears, and maces were more common than the swords we usually picture. These tools required less space to use effectively in such tight conditions. The head was one of the most common targets during battle. Helmets could provide protection, but they were not always worn by everyone. Some were knocked off in the struggle, and others may have been removed in the heat of the fight, despite the risk. Historical studies have shown that most fatal wounds from battlefields of this era came from strikes to the top of the head or the neck. Swinging a sword in wide arcs was not practical in a dense formation, so downward blows were more common. Even without a weapon, fists, shields, and anything within reach could be used to strike an opponent. Swords, despite their fame, were not the primary weapon for most fighters. They were expensive, difficult to master, and typically reserved for nobles or professional soldiers. In fact, swords accounted for only a fraction of the total weaponry on the battlefield. Many common soldiers fought with tools adapted from farming like pitchforks, scythes, or even sharpened shovels. These makeshift weapons could be just as dangerous as finely crafted blades. After all, the outcome did not depend on the elegance of the weapon, but on landing a blow when the opportunity came. Armor was a critical part of survival, but it came with its own dangers. Research on medieval helmets has shown that the temperature inside could climb above 110 degrees Fahrenheit in less than 20 minutes. In hot weather or under direct sun, the heat could become unbearable. There are accounts from history of knights passing away from heat and suffocation inside their armor before the battle was even over. Imagine trying to focus on fighting while feeling as though every breath is heavy and every step weighs you down. The physical demands of battle were relentless. Even if you managed to stay standing through the fight, the retreat or pursuit could be just as hazardous. During the Battle of Towton, many soldiers who fled were trampled by others in their rush to escape. Some were forced into rivers and could not make it to the other side. The panic of retreat often turned into a wave of chaos that swept up everyone, friend and foe alike. Once the fighting stopped, the battlefield entered another grim phase. The victors would search through the field looking for anything of value. Armor, weapons, clothing, and even small items like pins or buckles were taken. These were not simply trophies, they were supplies for future battles. Chainmail and armor could be reused, and weapons could be repaired or reforged. Nothing went to waste, and this often meant the remains of fallen soldiers were stripped of everything. Historical accounts describe this practice clearly. The famous Bayeux Tapestry, which depicts the Battle of Hastings in 1066, shows soldiers removing armor from those who had fallen. Chronicles from the time note that after some battles, soldiers left the field with nothing but the clothes they were born with. Even tents and camp supplies were taken from the defeated, as these items were valuable resources for any army. For those who had passed away, the treatment after battle depended heavily on rank and importance. High-ranking knights or nobles might be transported back home for a proper burial, often in a church. Ordinary soldiers, however, were usually placed in mass graves on or near the battlefield. The idea of a ceremonial farewell was rare for most fighters. War was not a place for dignity. It was a place for survival. Some accounts also describe actions meant to intimidate enemies or display dominance, though these events were often recorded as shocking or unusual even at the time. Such acts were reminders that chivalry and honor, while popular in songs and stories, were not always followed in the heat of conflict. For the average soldier, staying alive and keeping some sense of safety was far more important than upholding ideals. What many do not realize is that surviving a medieval battle was rarely about skill alone. Training could help, but luck played a major role. The timing of your movements, the direction of an enemy's strike, and even the simple chance of standing in the right spot could determine whether you made it through. And surviving the fight did not always mean the danger was over. Injuries, disease, and exhaustion claimed many in the days that followed. These battles were less about heroics and more about enduring one of the most physically and mentally demanding experiences imaginable. The battlefield tested not just strength, but also the ability to keep moving forward through fear, noise, and chaos. And even with all the preparation in the world, there was no guarantee you would return home. When the dust began to settle after a medieval battle, the scene was far from peaceful. The field would be filled with scattered equipment, damaged weapons, and the remains of warriors who had given everything in the fight. Victory for one side did not mean safety for all. The winning army often stayed behind to secure whatever could be reused or sold. Armor was carefully removed, weapons gathered, and anything of value taken. Even basic clothing could be worth reclaiming, as replacing gear was costly, and supplies were never guaranteed. Chroniclers of the time recorded the aftermath in detail. One account described how, after a hard-fought battle, soldiers left with nothing more than what they were born with. Another tells of enemy camps being stripped of their treasures, from gold coins and tableware to horses and tents. Every resource had value, and nothing was left behind if it could be carried. For the fallen, the end was often anonymous. Unless someone was of high rank or special importance, there was little chance of being returned home for burial. Instead, most were placed into large graves, often alongside friend and foe alike. The battlefield itself became their resting place. Only the most prominent warriors received transport back to their families for formal ceremonies. This stark contrast between rank and treatment after battle was a constant reminder of how deeply class-shaped medieval life, even in death. There were moments when acts carried out after a battle were meant to shock or demoralize the enemy. While rare, such events were recorded and passed down as warnings or tales of cruelty. These incidents stood in stark opposition to the ideals of chivalry celebrated in songs and legends. The truth was that medieval warfare was driven less by noble codes and more by the practical needs of survival. Chivalry and honor might have been sung about in great halls, but on the field, survival was the priority. In reality, the chaos of a medieval battle left little room for ceremony or knightly heroics. Success often came down to quick thinking, adaptability, and being in the right place at the right time. A well-trained warrior could be eliminated in a moment by an unexpected strike, while someone with minimal training might walk away simply because chance favored them that day. Surviving the fight did not mean escaping danger entirely. The days and weeks following a battle brought their own challenges. Food supplies were often low, water sources could be unsafe, and injuries that might seem minor could quickly become life-threatening without proper care. Infection was common, and exhaustion lingered long after the battle had ended. Many who lived through the fighting never truly recovered their full strength. When we think about medieval battles, it is tempting to imagine great duels and shining armor under banners waving in the wind. The reality was far more demanding and dangerous. Soldiers endured extreme noise, physical strain, limited visibility, suffocating heat inside armor, and the constant threat of being trapped by their own formation. Every moment was a test, not just of combat skill, but of mental endurance. These were not brief skirmishes that ended quickly. Some battles dragged on for hours in harsh weather, and even those who fought bravely could find themselves overwhelmed by the sheer press of people around them. In the end, medieval battlefields were places where survival depended as much on fortune as on courage. The harsh truth is that lasting through one was less about strength alone and more about enduring the unpredictable chaos that defined warfare in that age. The next time you picture a medieval battle, remember that it was not a stage for heroic stories, but a struggle where every person, knight or common soldier, faced the same storm of sound, fear, and uncertainty. For most, the goal was simple: stay on your feet, keep moving, and hope that luck stayed by your side until the fight was over.